It's the gardening astronomer here, back again. Today I'm going to say a few things about how to use your backyard composter to get good results. I know what you're thinking. Does the world need another video on composting? And maybe we don't. You can go out there and look at those other videos and you'll probably learn quite a lot about composting. I encourage it. But if you're like me, you have trouble getting these little backyard units to give you the results that you're looking for. I've figured out a few strategies over the years and I want to pass them on to you just in case they can help you out. So let's carry on. The compost experts will tell you that you should be able to make a compost pile and get it cooking and have beautiful fresh compost in a matter of weeks. The problem with these units, these small units, is that they're actually too small. They're about half the volume of what you'd really want in a compost pile. So things don't really get cooking. The other basic problem people have with these is they don't pay enough attention to the mixture of ingredients that go in. You need to have a mixture of greens and browns to get a good chemistry and a good composting activity going. And thirdly, I'm not sure about this one, but we don't always have our compost container in exactly the right place. Perhaps I'd get better compost if it was in a sunny location, but this is where it's good for me, next to my house. It's a convenient spot. So those three reasons are why perhaps your compost isn't turning out the way you like. Now I'm going to go on and give you some tips on how to make it better. Before we go on, let's say a few words about temperature. I have a compost thermometer to monitor the progress of my compost. You don't need one, but it's helpful to monitor how your compost is doing, whether it's cold, warm, active, or hot. Traditional hot composting, you want the temperature to be over to the right there, 130 degrees to 160 degrees Fahrenheit, which is above 55 degrees centigrade. Warm compost is in the range 80 to 100 degrees. Right now my compost is on the verge between warm and active, 100 degrees to 130 degrees Fahrenheit. So obviously the warmer it is in there, the quicker the composting activity proceeds. But don't despair. If your compost is not really hot, it will still compost. It just takes a little bit longer. Okay, now it's time to feed our compost pile. I've got the typical things that you'd bring from your kitchen. This is a couple of days worth of things. I'll show you them as I put them in. There's some dead flowers. We love our coffee, so there's some coffee grounds here. These espresso pucks, you need to squash them up because otherwise they'll go through without being broken down. There's some potato peels, some torn up boxboard. There's some cantaloupe, all kinds of cool things. You name it, we've got it. So that's what people mostly put in their compost, is kitchen scraps. But I discovered this the hard way, is that if you only put in green things fresh from the kitchen, your compost turns all slimy and smelly. And that's because the wrong kind of bacteria are growing in it. So here's the number one tip for making your compost turn out otherwise. As well as greens in the compost, you need to add browns. Now, in my case, I keep a container full of shredded leaves next to my composter, and every time I put in greens, I put in at least the same amount of shredded leaves, maybe a little bit more. It's really important to have a mixture of browns and greens for your compost to turn out just right, nice and crumbly with a nice aroma, no smell. I didn't know this when I first started out, and it took me a few years to figure it out. Another great brown to add to your compost pile is cardboard, like this egg carton. The worms love this stuff, but you need to shred it up before you use it, so into smallish pieces. Cardboard is just, you know, concentrated wood chips. And people say wood chips are good for mulching and composting. So as the saying goes, if it lived once, it can live again. The microbes that do your composting for you don't only need scraps from the kitchen and things like leaves and brown to give carbon. They need water and air. So you have to make sure that your compost is moist but not sopping wet. It should be about the consistency, the wetness of a squeezed out sponge. I'm just going to add a little water to mine. You don't have to do this very often, only when it gets dry. So that I just gave it a good soak there. I won't have to do that for a couple of days. Composting doesn't only need good ingredients and water, it needs air. If the air doesn't circulate, the wrong kind of bacteria will proliferate, and that's when you get that smelly, slimy kind of compost. To get the right kind of bacteria working in your compost, you need to aerate it. And I have a fork here that I use maybe only about once a week. I go in there and just mix everything up and turn it over just to get the air and everything circulating. If you have a thermometer, you'll know when you need to do this, because what'll happen is that the temperature in the compost will drop, and what you want to do is get that started again. So mix it up with a fork and you'll get some improvement in your composting. So I've mentioned that I don't really get hot compost in this little composting unit that I have, but it does get fairly warm. And so what happens is the worms do most of the work. They don't like heat, and they'll actually avoid heat. In a regular compost, they'll move in after the compost has cooled down. But my compost never really gets hot, so the worms are always in there. They find their sweet spot somewhere inside and they work away on the compost. And like I say, they don't like it hot. So in a way, this kind of composter is like a flow-through worm composter outside. You put fresh stuff in at the top, it breaks down a little bit, the worms work on it down here in the middle, and at the bottom is the finished compost. You'll find that at the very bottom, when the compost is finished, the worms aren't there. They're somewhere else in the compost. Nobody wants to live in their own poop, right? So it makes sense. Anyway, you put stuff in at the top, the worms work on it, and it comes out the bottom. Before I finish off, I just want to make one remark. I'm not saying it's impossible to get these backyard composters to provide hot compost. In fact, another YouTuber named Prairie Plant Girl, who has much colder temperatures than here, can actually achieve that. And so I'm going to provide a link to her composting video so you can see how to achieve that result. I think one of the key factors in getting a hot compost is basically to start with a completely empty container and then fill it to the top with fresh stuff, like, well, dried leaves, but fresh green stuff with lots of nitrogen, and fill it up and really get it going. Get it nice and damp, give it air, and turn it. And that's what she does. I think you can do it, but I don't think you can do it in a piecemeal kind of way where you're continually adding stuff every few days. You really have to start with a complete pile to get it cooking. That's just my hypothesis. I've never tried it. Maybe you'll have better luck. I just emptied out my composter a month or so ago, so I don't expect to see fully finished compost down there. But let's go down and see what we can find. I bet you we're going to see some half-finished compost and a bunch of worms. Let's go check that out. Sure enough, look at that. So this compost isn't finished because the worms are still working at it. So maybe by the middle or the end of the summer, this will be finished compost. But I'm happy to see those worms. There's a whole bunch of them in there. That's really good to see. So I hope you have as better luck with your compost following the tips that I've provided. Let me know in the comments how you make out. I can hear people asking, Dave, where do you come up with all those leaves to put in your compost? It's a great idea. Well, every fall, when the leaves fall from the trees, I rake them up like everyone else, but I don't put them in bags and give them to the city. I shred them and I put them in this wire container right here, and I keep them over the winter. They break down a little, but I use them to add to my compost, and I also use them as mulch on my vegetable beds in the summer. By the end of the summer, I'll have used up all of these leaves, which will incorporate either into my compost or into my garden soil, and I'll start over. This is the secret weapon to backyard gardening in the city. Collect your leaves and use them. They're black gold. Thanks for watching.